thinking about craft traditions and also thinking about folk culture and how that term folk is, how that's defined, how that's used in certain cultures, where we sort of draw that line. So I was asked by my old friend Tony Bluestone, who is on the board here at the Pratt Museum, if I would be interested in having a show that sort of spoke to and with their collection of objects. Craft traditions, folk traditions, is something that I've thought about for a long time in the making of my own work. And so Tony wanted to know if I would be interested in having a show that actually spoke directly to a collection of historical objects.
I am Tony Bluestone. I am an artist and I am the curator of this show. I'm also a board member at the Pratt Museum where we are, and I was asked to curate an exhibit here, and I invited the artist Cal Siegel to come produce a work that also was in dialogue with the museum's collection and the museum itself. So much of the work that Cal is making speaks to a kind of past industrial of the recent past, right? Like the mufflers, right? Like a kind of car industry. And there's so much in the collection that deals with the early American industry that was considered quite contemporary at the time. And so I thought also just formally, there was an interesting relationship between the forms because Cal is dealing with contemporary technology, but through, hand-built methods like the ceramics that he makes, the carvings that, you'll see throughout the museum, all the carvings that are related to tramp art, and then using those as stands for other pieces. So like really bringing in the past to hold up the present is part of what he does. And so I think that was the reason why I thought of him.
I used the objects from the collection. So these are Toby mugs, which is they were industrially replicated and produced, and they have Rip Van Winkle's face on them. A lot of my previous work has been about the psychology of architecture, or the way that a space can collect and hold energy over time. And so putting a staircase inside of an architectural object for me, just ask questions about the psychology of spaces. And I think this house, the Zadock Pratt house specifically, is something that has, many people have been through here. So there's a lot of collective energy that I think is held in a space like this. And this is a sort of a microcosm of that, or a reference to that.
Well, I've known Cal for a long time. I live in Brooklyn. I grew up in Rhinebeck across the river. This is probably my 4th or 5th time coming to the Pratt Museum. And well, I think it's really cool because we often think about history as something that already happened and is kind of finite and complete. And I really like how Cal is intervening in that narrative and sort of changing that story, or changing the stories a little bit, or tweaking them, or offering new interpretations of the objects. So I think that's really cool. It kind of shows how flexible history can be in an interesting way. I love this piece here, which is really mostly the museum's collection. It's 5 horns from the rent strike, but Cal's put them on these stands that he's made. And what I like about this piece is that the orientation is really almost the piece. The horns could be shown on their side the way they're meant to be used. Kind of when you use a horn, it's projected into space, but Cal's tilted them upright, kind of creating this other way of relating to this shape and conjuring other connotations that one might not approach this object with originally.
There's a type of humor in the work, and I think it's hard to make art that's funny, that's not sardonic, right? But it sort of invites you into the joke, right? Like, okay, there's a barrel here, the barrel is also a table, the function of the barrel shifts, and it's sort of funny, like the way in which life happens, right? Like, we have these different parts of life that carry these stories, and then they sort of slip in, and there's a joke there. And Cal's really great at noticing how to bring that sort of humorous moment into something a little bit more profound, right? Like taking the rent strike horns, and then they become witch hats, right? They become personified through the gesture of putting them on a stand, right? So there's a lot about noticing what is happening right? What kind of stories are being told, and then bringing our awareness as the viewer into that. And I think that's a really special and exciting thing that art can do. And when it brings humor into it, I feel like it's this sort of like gentle tap on the shoulder of like, look over here, which feels really exciting, particularly about this show.
Yeah, so these are all the bottles pulled from the entire museum collection, and I made a table for them. A silhouette. The silhouette is sort of a form that I'm interested in. I think like it's interesting to deal with history by flattening it and then giving it dimension, so from picture to sculpture. And so that's sort of why this silhouette bottle form is reflected all over the walls. And then the bottles here. So almost like a shadow cast. I really hope that there are a lot of access points for a lot of different people to enter into this work. I want for it to be, open and porous and available. But I also want it to ask challenging questions. So I want people to feel welcome and also challenged.
So many museums feel so off limits, right? And that you can't touch the stuff, or it's so precious. Like I was recently in Rhode Island, and there's all these old mansions there, and it's really protected. The wealth is really protected, and that can't even imagine getting to see a contemporary artist start to intervene with that. And so I think a space like this, yes, history is being preserved. Yes, the home is being preserved. There's a lot of attention to preservation, but there's also like an invitation that allows an intersection for something that's not completely contemporary, right? Like a contemporary art museum where the focus is exclusively on the now, and it's not exclusively historical. Like there's an intersection, and I think there's an honesty that's always present in how we look at history. We're always bringing the present into the historical lens, whether we acknowledge it or not. And we're always bringing history into the contemporary lens, whether we acknowledge it or not. So getting to do that here in a way that's like very tactile and hands-on feels exciting and rare, like not something that I've seen that much of around these historical house museums.